There we go. Welcome everybody to today's Monday guest speaker. We're glad that you made it. Before we get into sort of the brass tacks, just had a few more announcements to make. We do have another speaker next week, Amy Shaw, talking about emotional first aid, part of which is dealing with job rejection, which is honestly pretty helpful. It helps everybody out, and it'll be a pretty good talk. So look forward to that. After that, though, we'll be on a little bit of a hiatus until the later part of January. So we'll take a little break for the holidays. But the next one will be pretty good too. As usual, stay connected for our Tech Careers newsletter. We have hiring fairs always on the horizon. We have demo day very close in the horizon next month, which you'll hear more about. But the best way to hear about that stuff is stay posted to Slack and keep up with our newsletters. Just a general reminder, make sure to keep yourself muted unless you're asking a question. And as always, you can ask questions in the chat. There will be time to ask some questions during the presentation. So really, without much else, we have Erissa Duvall. Erissa is a QA with Good Maps and an accessibility engineer with CVS, and is here to talk some about accessibility, a pretty important topic. So I'll turn it over to her.
Thanks, David. I'm going to kind of use my introduction to accessibility slides that I use for a lot of when I do my conference talks, but it's not going to be quite as strict to this as I would normally follow, because I want to encourage you all to ask me questions if you have them as I go through. Just for a little added background, a lot of my accessibility work, because I've worked at the American Printing House for the Blind as internal IT, so that's kind of where I got my start with accessibility and supporting primarily a lot of assistive technologies, so things like screen readers or braille embossers, which are basically printers but that print braille, and dictation software and all kinds of different hardware, software solutions related to accessibility. From there, I've kind of gone on and for a few years there, it was mostly I was working on learning more about accessibility, just kind of self-taught. So doing things like working on different certifications or just online learning and talking to other accessibility professionals and speaking at conferences and tech meetups and things of that nature to kind of share what I was learning. Now, as David said, I work as a sort of part-time QA with Good Maps here in town, which is a company that builds indoor navigation applications. So some things similar to good Google Maps, but with the focus being on being something that is accessible to what started out as individuals with low vision or who were blind, and has now kind of grown up to be just accessibility and more so in general, because they started to see just more of the benefits that it could give to the broader accessibility community. And then I'm working full-time as a accessibility engineer with CVS. So I do things like accessibility testing. I help out with questions related to various assistive technologies with HR and IT, particularly when it comes to reasonable accommodations, just because I have a broad spectrum of experience with different solutions. So I'll help with recommending things and helping to test them on the internal infrastructure, things of that nature, on top of my regular testing. So just a little CYA, and if you ever get into doing talks, I will say that this is a very good CYA to include, because a lot of companies have a lot of red tape around if you want to go and do public speaking, because there's the potential for you to be interpreted as being doing it as a official representative of a company. So sometimes there's a lot of red tape around that. To kind of help prevent those issues, I always include my little disclaimer that just says, I am not officially acting as a representative of my current or former employers. And also because I tend to talk a lot about legislation. I also like to just add that I am not in any way licensed as a lawyer, so I can't give definitive legal advice, because there are a lot of laws out there around if people within reason interpret you to be giving formal legal advice. There can be a lot of trouble there. So my little CYA to hopefully prevent those issues. So in general, what I have kind of in this presentation is just sort of some general introduction to what is accessibility, some good topics around that, models of disability, disability impacts, so how we determine the impact of a disability, which then helps us when we're trying to figure out how to make things accessible to people. And then accessibility guidelines and regulations, because those do tend to guide us in how we determine what's accessible or how we test for accessibility. And then kind of getting into the whys and the whats of why do we care about making things accessible, and what can we do in furtherance of making things accessible. So what is accessibility? To put it very simply, accessibility is just how well can someone access information, services, facilities, anything like that, regardless of what their personal capabilities are. And obviously it's within reason. We're not going to expect that someone with an elementary level education is going to be able to understand something that is intended for a doctorate audience. But general things like being able to go to the store, go work in a job, obtain training for certain jobs, how well are people able to access that, understand it, and actually participate in it? And then that does lead us into, well, what do we consider disability? And for the purposes of this presentation, we look at disability as there's a mismatch between the person and whatever environment they are trying to interact with. And because of that, the environment creates a barrier to the person that makes it more difficult, if not impossible, for them to participate, to access whatever services or facilities are available. The focus is on the fact that it's the environment that's creating the barrier. And I'll go a little bit more into why that focus is put on the environment. And then another thing is, I mentioned assistive technologies a little earlier, and assistive technologies, you might also hear them called adaptive technologies, or AT. And this is just kind of any hardware, software that someone might use in order to mitigate the barriers created by the environment. So for instance, it can be the glasses that people wear. It can be screen readers. Or for instance, I was telling David about this earlier, I use my smartwatch because I actually have some working memory issues, and I have some focus issues that can result in me just being time blind. And so I have my watch to kind of help me out with that. There's a lot of other things. I don't know if you can see it in the background back there, but I've actually got my Xbox adaptive controller back there. It's that white rectangle with the two black circles on it. That's actually a assistive technology device. It is used to allow people to custom build their own controllers to allow them to play various games, even if they have limited maybe hand use or certain other mobility typically conditions. And then just as a final note before I switch to the next slide, I also like to point out that there is this numeronym, which a numeronym is when you take some of the letters out of a word and you swap them for numbers, and the end result kind of acts like an acronym that's representative of the original word somehow. This can be things like 24/7. 24/7, we instantly associate that as meaning all day, every day. It can be things like Y2K for the year 2000. And then for accessibility, there's A11Y, which stands for the fact that the word accessibility begins with the letter A, ends with the letter Y, and there's 11 characters in between those two. You'll also see it used, numeronyms used a lot within the tech and pop culture community and other places, such as like there's one for I think like the word internationalization, virtualization, a lot of other terms like that. Now, I mentioned earlier putting the focus when we're talking about disability and the barriers that are created, putting the focus on the environment. And that comes from what's known as the social model of disability. Traditionally, we tended to focus on the medical model. It's what a lot of like ADA regulations and Section 508, things like that are based off of. And the medical model focused on the idea of, someone has a medical condition and that's creating a barrier for them. But that model tended to be problematic, particularly because it puts a lot of the focus on the idea that there is this baseline for what is considered normal, and anything that falls outside that is deviant. It needs to be cured, it has to be treated, which leads to a lot of problems. I mean, for instance, you can have someone who has hearing loss, and under the medical model, people would tend to really try to push the idea of, we'll get a cochlear implant. Well, not everybody who has hearing loss wants to get the major surgery to get a cochlear implant. And even if they do, it's not necessarily going to help them, and it's not going to give them the same level of hearing as, say, for instance, I would have. And so that was kind of, problematic. It also ignores a lot of other non-necessarily medical conditions that can result in barriers, which is why we tend to look at the social model. The social model basically is saying that, hey, the environment is not really built for how diverse people's bodies and lived experiences truly are. And so it's really the environment that's creating the barrier. If a mother is carrying her child and she has to go somewhere where there's no elevators, if there was just an elevator, she'd have a more easier time traveling around. Technically, though, while carrying that child, she's limited in terms of her mobility. It can be more difficult to go up and down stairs, especially if they have a stroller. That's also, of course, also making a barrier to people who might be in a wheelchair, the elderly, things of that nature. And so that's where we're putting that focus on the fact that the environment is what is creating the barrier. With the social model, we can also look at things such as if you consider a construction worker working at a construction site, while all the heavy, loud equipment is running, a construction worker hopefully is wearing hearing protection. But while they're wearing that hearing protection, they can't depend as heavily on auditory signals. So they have to focus more on visual signals. They have a disability when it comes to anything auditory related. And so we're tending to see a little bit more of a focus put on the social model versus the traditional medical model. Now, the social model does not ignore the fact that medical conditions play a role. It just looks at the fact that it's not always medically related, and the conditions aren't, like, the impact isn't always present. Things can come and go in terms of how they're impacting us or impact us at different severities. So, I mentioned, disabilities, not always being there and them varying a lot in terms of like how they impact us. Here, sorry, like if it may have made my other screen disappear for a second. I was trying to bring up something here. Disabilities can just impact us in a lot of different ways. Disabilities can involve impacting your ability to eat, to breathe, to interpret information, to see and hear. It can impact your ability to just care for yourself. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, it's not always apparent visual. It's not always something that you can obviously see. And it's not all the time necessarily. For instance, since this is kind of an example that I personally can speak from, I have spina bifida and scoliosis. It's a deformity in the way that my spinal cord and the bones and such in my spine developed. And some days, totally no impact. You wouldn't know anything was different about me. Other times, it can hurt to the point of nearly making me cry. And sometimes it can be kind of sudden in how it sets in. It's very just kind of all over the place. So it's kind of like a mixture of permanent and temporary. And then there's also a lot of conditions that are situational in terms of how they disable someone. So for instance, I mentioned the parent carrying their child. Well, as long as they're carrying the child around, their mobility is limited. But once they set the child down, at least in terms of mobility, they're not as limited anymore. Cognitively, they may now be bothered because now they're going to be driven crazy by the kid running around, but at least they're, going to be able to move around a little bit better. So those are just things to kind of take into consideration. And on this slide, I have the dreaded critical failure, or rolling a 1 on a D20 in Dungeons and Dragons, which is just synonymous with like completely failing at something. And I like this picture because disability can be a lot like rolling a die in Dungeons and Dragons, because you never quite know exactly like how it's going to impact you. You might have certain permanent modifiers or temporary modifiers that cause it to be more likely to negatively impact you or to always impact you, as is the case with some permanent disabilities. But I always just kind of like that idea of just thinking of it like that, as like you're rolling a die, and then just depending on whatever factors are going on is going to determine how likely it can be to cause problems. It helps if I click on the right screen. Okay. So now, when we're determining kind of like what is or how accessible something is, there's a lot of different guidelines you can find out there. These are, of course, digital, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, also known as WCAG, are the primary ones that you'll see used for digital content. There are also ones that deal with physical accessibility. For instance, there are actually like ADA guidelines for kiosks. So like if you go to a kiosk in a store, like how high can certain controls be off the ground, or how much distance can there be, like how close does someone have to be able to actually get to the screen to be able to reach things. There are ADA guidelines for like cruise ships and lots of other different environments. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, though, are going to probably be the ones that impact, in terms of what you're learning through Code Louisville, are going to be the most impactful on you. They most recently came out with 2.2. I think it was actually just in October that they finally released a 2.2. And though that's steadily being adopted by a lot of places, but typically a lot of your regulations are still more in the 2.1 version, and it'll probably be that way for a little while. But it's good to be kind of familiar with both of them. And the nice thing is like if you get fully 2.1 compatible or compliant, you're pretty much you're almost set on 2.2. They just added a lot of extra things in terms of like some of it was cognitive, some of it was with regards to touch area size and a few other things. But it's also important to note that like guidelines are just a foundation. They aren't going to catch all the potential issues that you could run into. And that's where a lot of like user feedback and experience comes into play. A good example of this, if you ever get a chance to look up, I don't put it in my presentation very often, just to kind of be on the safe side. But if you ever get a chance to look up the disability pride flag, in 2019, there was an artist who designed a disability pride flag, and it was a dark black background with these very vibrant colored stripes zigzagging up across the image. And it looked cool. It was really neat looking, but certain color patterns or like large chunks of color can cause a flashing effect on particularly on mobile devices. And I think it can be kind of easy to tell how that could be a problem for something that is meant to be for people with disabilities, to have a flag that is flashing that could potentially trigger headaches, epileptic seizures, things of that nature. Just not exactly a good image to have. Which is why, though, in I think it was 2021, it was either 2020 or 2021, she actually redesigned it with help from the disability community to make it more visually safe. They changed the stripes so that they're just straight instead of the zigzag. It's not quite as vibrant of colors, and I think they even they changed the order in which the colors were on the screen. I'm not 100% sure if there was a accessibility reason behind that part, but overall it was meant to create a more visually safe image. I've also seen an example of this at a place that I worked where they had something similar that happened where when you scrolled up the app, it created a sort of a flashing effect, and it actually caused someone internally at that company to have problems. And thankfully, they were on the team that was working on the apps. They were able to push through the changes to get that resolved. But can you imagine being a customer and going to an app and it gives you an epileptic seizure while you're just trying to access the information for the company? Wouldn't exactly be the best experience, to say the least, and would probably make you not really want to go back. I mean, at that point, you kind of have to hopefully take the company's word that they've fixed it later. So yeah, that's why, again, that's something that isn't necessarily caught. There is a flashing guideline within the WCAG guidelines, but it wouldn't have caught that because it's not a typical animated flashing effect. It's an effect that's just created by the way the device loads the information. Now, building up from guidelines, another good thing to know is there's regulations. ADA is probably one of the most common ones that you'll end up hearing about. There's also Section 508. ADA deals with physical and digital accessibility in terms of employment, businesses, public facilities, things of that nature. Whereas Section 508 is kind of the same thing, but it's, Section 508 in particular is dealing with government. It's part of the Rehabilitative Act. But it deals with like people offering services to government entities or government entities providing services to the public. So you'll see like Section 508 brought up a lot with like DOD, like if you go to the DMV, if you're providing services to a government department, Section 508 comes into play. And there are a few other different regulations. And if you want to learn more about them, I will have these slides available afterwards. And the W3C actually has a really good page that lists a lot of different regulations worldwide. It is not an exhaustive list, though. I will just forewarn you on that. But it is a pretty good list. I'll also have a link tree at the end of this that has a link to my personal website where I have a lot of the resources that I've talked about so far and will talk about in this presentation, just available if you want to look them over. So with all that said, why? Why do we care about making things accessible? What's the drive to do it? And first and foremost, it's just the fact that when things aren't accessible, you're unfairly blocking people from being able to access information. And when we actually make things accessible, we're removing those barriers. We're giving people more equal access. And through that, we can help to make other people feel wanted, feel welcome. And when you create a more welcoming environment, regardless of whether it's your community, your company, or even in your home, you help to make people want to stick around or want to join. So you're going to see like better retention. You're going to see people want to contribute and give back more, because how likely are you to give back to something that you didn't really feel like you were wanted in? And you're also going to see more innovation and progress in anything you do when you have this welcoming, accessible environment, because again, you're going to be attracting people to come in. More people are going to feel welcome. A more diverse group of people are going to feel welcome, especially because through diversity, equity, and inclusion, you'll hear those words a lot. They're more than just buzzwords. They are very important aspects of any sort of society, culture, workplace. But to have true diversity, equity, and inclusion, you need to have accessibility. To have true accessibility, you've got to have diversity, equity, and inclusion. You've got to like be welcoming to everyone. And when you've got that very diverse group of people involved, you get all these different lived experiences that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And all these people that have these different lived experiences, they're going to have different perspectives on how things could be done or possible solutions. So they're going to be more likely to come up with maybe a solution that you didn't think of before, something that pushes things forward and further improves things in ways that otherwise just wouldn't have happened or would have taken a lot longer to figure out. So, I mean, it's just one of those things, like you benefit overall. Now, from a business standpoint, obviously, just saying it's the right thing to do doesn't always help. So that's why I always like give the one monetary example I love to give is just the fact that based on the World Health Organization and the CDC, around 25 to 26% of people in the US have a disability. And that number stays pretty consistent across the board. You'll see a little variation here and there, especially if there's certain circumstances going on, of course, in different parts of the world at any point in time that can impact the number of people that are suffering from a disability at the time, or that are maybe certain groups have different like conditions and stuff that are just more likely to happen. And so you'll see some variance in the numbers, but it's typically around 25 to 26%. And when you start thinking globally, there's over 8 billion people in the world. So effectively, there's at least 2 billion people in the world right now with a disability. That's not a small number. And that's a huge percentage of people that you could be potentially just saying, hey, we don't want your business. We don't want you to feel welcome here if you don't make things accessible. So with all that, what can we do? There's a lot of things that we can do. The one that you'll probably hear the most often in the tech community is the idea of shift left. And this is just the idea that we include accessibility from as early in any process as we can. And this can apply at home, this can apply at work, with HR processes, IT processes, building a new marketing campaign, anything really shift left can kind of apply to. Because the thing is that the earlier you include accessibility in the process, the more likely you're going to catch problems. And the sooner that you can catch problems, well, the cheaper it's going to be to fix it, because it's always typically easier to fix a problem before it's actually a problem. The next thing you can do is just speaking up. There can be times where people who have a disability are afraid to speak up because they fear being retaliated against. I've actually experienced it myself, being like treated as though I wasn't as capable just because I had a disability. And it can be a difficult mental block to really overcome. And then there can be just other times where, because the person is encountering a barrier, they may not realize that they are missing something. So if you notice that something is happening, you speak up. The next is, you'll commonly hear the saying within the accessibility community, nothing without us. And basically that's saying, when we're trying to make accessibility decisions, when we're trying to make decisions about really anything, we should try to actually include the people with the lived experiences. This is especially important in like any kind of testing that's done, because the thing is, I can train myself all day, every day, on screen reader usage, on using voiceover on an iPhone or talkback on an Android phone. I can train myself all day, every day on how to use Dragon Naturally Speaking, which is a voice control / dictation application, or reading Braille even. But at the end of the day, my experience with it, the way I interact with it, the way I use it, isn't going to ever be quite the same as someone who that's their lived experience day in and day out. They may notice things that I miss because I can't completely remove the feedback I'm getting from like being able to see. I can't completely cut out all of the feedback I receive from anything I hear. Whereas someone who is living day in and day out without being able to hear or without being able to see, to at least to the same degree as I am, is going to have a different perspective. It's going back to that whole, all those different diverse perspectives. Another thing that people sometimes don't think about is using people first language. So, for instance, if I was introducing a fellow developer who happened to be blind, I'm typically not going to refer to them as, hey, this is my blind developer friend, John. I'm going to say, hey, this is my friend, John. He's a developer. And then maybe if it's like relevant to the conversation, and he's blind, and which, I mean, it might be relevant if I'm introducing him And I give that extra context because we're talking about screen reader usage. I'm like, well, hey, he uses screen readers every day because he's blind. So he's going to know better than me. And then another thing is following best practices and guidelines. And this is things like making sure to use proper HTML syntax, or properly using ARIA. This is a big one when it comes to web development and application development, because people are really, really bad about wanting to just pepper ARIA attributes everywhere. Whereas the first 2 rules out of the 5 rules for ARIA are very focused on the idea that just don't use ARIA. Because ARIA is meant to be a gap filler. It's meant to be that you stick to semantic HTML. So that's things like using a header element, using a paragraph element, using a H1, H2, versus like using a div and then styling it to look like a heading, or using a div and then giving it the role of heading, and then like maybe the ARIA level of 1, 2, 3, whatever. Instead, you want to actually use the semantic elements, and then you just use ARIA if it's necessary to fill in gaps. So for example, a very good example would be email HTML. Email HTML actually does not support landmark elements. So like header, footer, section, some of those other ones are not supported in email HTML. So in those cases, you would actually be completely doing the right thing by instead like having divs and then giving them the role of like header or the role of section. Or there can be other like embedded platforms and things like that where maybe not all HTML elements are completely supported. And so you would use like ARIA to sort of fill in the gaps where there's not quite the compatibility there. Let's see. Now, there are tons of resources out there. I have this like list here, but again, I will have a link for my link tree where you can get like all these. So don't feel like you have to like try to write all this stuff down. Which actually with that, I'll just go ahead and switch to this one, which has got the URL as well as a QR code if you prefer that. And with that, I appreciate everybody listening and questions.
Feel free to put any questions you have in the chat, or you can also just unmute yourself and talk as well.
I just realized I was muted. Yay. I saw Kayla's comment in the chat, and it actually like made me think of a common question I sometimes get when I do my presentations is people will say, oh, well, none of our customers currently need accessibility, or none of our employees need it. And I'm like, well, all your customers and employees are going to get older at some point. We're all going to get older at some point. So at the very least, you're going to start seeing a need for accessibility there. And then, of course, there's also the whole idea that like a lot of people who have a disability don't speak up really. I've only really started to become vocal about my own disabilities within just the last few years. And that's mostly been just a matter of being fortunate enough to work in a few companies where they were very welcoming to me bringing those things up. And then also there's the idea too that even if you're not creating for the people today, think of the people tomorrow, because you never know when something's going to happen to change someone's circumstances. I actually had a colleague that very suddenly, he was a Java developer, and he just suddenly lost eyesight, completely lost his eyesight. And so now he's effectively having to completely relearn how to do his job, because he has to learn how to use screen readers and other tools to be able to interact with the computer now. So, things to think about. Alexi?
Hi, yeah. I just was wondering if you had any suggestions on deciding sort of what level of accessibility we should be aiming for. Should we just generally aim for sort of the AA level, or do you have any recommendations on how to determine that?
Well, okay, so like, what now? Just to sort of like give context to anybody else as well. What Alexi's talking about when it comes to like AA. In the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, there are 3 levels of conformance: A, AA, and AAA. A is like the absolute bare minimum. It's the stuff that if you're not even really trying, you really should be hitting. AA is what's considered like the ideal standard. It's typically what a lot of regulations and legal requirements will require that you go for. And then there is AAA. AAA, even the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines say that you don't have to reach for AAA. AAA is kind of like the nice added extras. It's things like offering sign language interpretation for videos. Just like it's like extras, and some of it's a lot of stuff that may be very particularly scenario based. So traditionally, AA is going to be what you aim for.
Tasha does have a question. She asked, when getting started, what's one of the most important things to learn first?
Honestly, I kind of think some of the basics, like what I brought up during this, can be like really good starting points. Microsoft actually has an introduction to accessibility course on their Microsoft Learn site that I very highly recommend. It kind of goes a little bit more in depth. One thing though that a lot of people don't often doesn't get brought up in a lot of accessibility courses is accessibility etiquette. And that's kind of dealing with if you're interacting with someone who has a disability, what's the the etiquette for asking questions or interacting with them, and I think honestly that can be very valuable for everybody to learn, because I think it gets you thinking about what some people with disabilities are having to go through day in and day out. You start to kind of get that awareness, I guess. It's things like if you see someone that has the traditional red-tipped white cane that you'll often see people with sight loss have, not grabbing onto their arm to guide them somewhere, and instead asking if they want help first. And then the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, if you're wanting to go more towards learning for creating a website or creating basic content, I think that can be actually a really great spot to start. Especially because, I mean, just looking through the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, it's not too complex to just initially go through it. And then you can always like delve deeper. It very much like lends itself to being able to like delve deeper where you feel you want to learn a little bit more. And it can maybe help guide you, pun intended, on your learning journey a little bit.
Speaking of the accessibility guidelines, Gregory asked a question about are the accessibility guidelines good to use for regular applications as well as web content, or is there a different standard for that?
Here, wait, I'm actually gonna make sure I'm just gonna close out my PowerPoint here for a second, because I think this would be a good time to bring up this other thing I was gonna show. Because that's the thing, web content accessibility guidelines is actually just one of a set. Now, web content accessibility guidelines is going to deal with any document or application that you're accessing digitally. So it's going to be like what you use for the majority of applications and websites. However, there are a couple of others that can be just nice to be like familiar with. You're probably not going to you're probably not going to hear about them quite as often, but they are, let me get this pulled up here real quick. The authoring tools accessibility guidelines and the user agent accessibility guidelines. If you've already gone through some of the or through some of the coursework in Code Louisville, you may have heard of the term user agent before. But first, like with the authoring tools guidelines, it's effectively WCAG, but it's geared more towards the tools that you're using to create the content. So things like Microsoft Word or Adobe Acrobat, or even an IDE like Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code. Those would kind of fall under authoring tools accessibility guidelines because you're using them to create the digital content. And then user agent accessibility guidelines is dealing with any application that you're using to like access and view the content. So typically your browser would be probably the most common user agent you would think of. It could also include things such as Adobe Reader, which you use to read PDFs. It could involve things like Microsoft Word, which I mean there's kind of a crossover, of course, there, because some of those tools that you use to view the content, you're also using to edit the content. I mean, if you think about it, even your browser, if you're using like a content management system, you're editing the content in the browser. So you're kind of using it as like both at that point. Yeah, I mean, typically you're going to look, like I said, you're going to look at the WCAG guidelines. That's going to be your most verbose. And it's going to be the one that's typically for legal purposes has the heaviest focus. And then just because I mentioned it earlier, I thought they had the rules right there, but I guess they don't. For where they've got there's 5 different rules for ARIA, but the most base concept when it comes to the rules of ARIA is just not using ARIA. It almost sounds like a form of Fight Club. See, and I noticed, I hope that answers your question, Gregory, without being too convoluted. See, Leo, I noticed, asked, there are many universities and colleges that post their accessibility guidelines. Do you use these, and if so, from which school? I don't really use like necessarily the guidelines that like I have seen some of the different guidelines that schools will post. Since they are typically covered under Section 508, they're almost like just consistently going to be WCAG based. However, there are some different universities that have some amazing content when it comes, or like guidelines for like how to make certain things accessible that I love to use. Actually had one open just a moment ago, and I think I still have it open here. I think it's like Pennsylvania State University, if I remember right, has like a really, really, really good accessibility page. I might have it under here. Well, shucks, I guess I do not have it. I'm actually going to pull that up because that is one of my favorite. And it's pretty quick for me to pull it up. Yeah. Accessibility.psu.edu. This has honestly been an awesome resource when I'm like trying to figure out like some suggestions for like how to make some things accessible. Because they've got things like making alt text for like complex images. So in a complex image in terms of accessibility is like for instance, if you have like a graph but you have it as like an image, how would you describe that graph to make sure you're actually presenting the image in an accessible way? They actually have like some really good ones on that, video captions, and just all kinds of amazing stuff. Another really good one, and I know for sure I have that one open because it's right here. Visa. Oh, here, I'll put that link in the chat. Another really good one, and I'll put this in the chat too. Visa actually has their global accessibility requirements completely open to the public. I actually found out about it when I interviewed with them a few years back. Sadly, did not get that position. It would have been so awesome. But it's really great because they have like all kinds of different like testing procedures written out, different tools that you can use. Just lots of great information there. Another good one is the ICT testing baseline for Section 508. This is what's used also for like the Department of Homeland Security's Trusted Tester certification courses. And it just kind of goes through and it's got like broken down into multiple sections. And it's like, okay, well, here's what the accessibility requirement is. Why do we test it, kind of thing. Some different issues to be aware of. And then it goes through and it actually gives you like some different like ways to test. Can be like that can be a really good way to kind of like learn a little bit more about testing, which if anybody is interested in trying it, make sure I pull up the right page here. This is actually the link for the Trusted Tester. If you go to like this self-enrollment portal, it's a completely free enrollment. You don't pay anything to like go through the courses or even take the certification test at the end. It is a fairly difficult test to go through. I will say that. It took me a while. They give you, I think, like 3 or 4 hours to complete the assessment. That's gives you an idea of like how much work is involved. And you even get like 3 attempts on it, I think. But it took me all 3 of them. I'm not ashamed to admit it because I know people that had to go back. Like I think you have to wait like so many months and then you can try it again. And it's all like procedurally generated or something like that. So it's you can't just like remember what was wrong the last time and get it right the next time. But it's a really good like free course for anybody that's just interested. Another really good one is if you install Accessibility Insights. It's a free open source tool. I've actually contributed to the open source repo for it. But the nice thing about it is it's got like some different like automated checks, manual checks, and let me see if I can. Oh, they actually changed it a little bit. Okay. If you go into like there's the Fast Pass, which has some automated tests. I will say, never rely purely on the automated tests. Automated tests are great. We love how much time they can save us, but they're just not going to catch all the issues, and they're not always going to accurately reflect what's going on the page. But then, oh, here we go. If you go to like the assessment section, it actually has like it has the automated checks followed by some manual test methods, kind of similar to what you saw on the ICT baseline. So it's really kind of neat. One really good example I like to give people when it comes to like why automated tests aren't what you want to completely depend on when it comes to accessibility testing is, say I have a page that has a whole bunch of images on it. Now with images, I have the option of I can have an alt attribute that has a value in it. I can have a null alt attribute, which is when I just put like alt, but I don't have it equaling anything, or I have it equaled to an empty string. Or I can give it the role of presentation. Now a null alt attribute or the role of presentation marks that image as decorative. And what that means is that when assistive technology picks up on that image, it'll say, oh, it's decorative. I can just ignore it. Well, an automated tool is going to be able to check to see if you have an alt attribute or if you have the role of presentation, but it's not going to necessarily know what was your purpose for adding that image to that page. Is it truly decorative? Is it informative? If there is like an alt attribute listed, does it actually make sense? Does it actually represent what the purpose of that image was? So yeah, that's kind of just why you don't want to like focus purely on like automated.
Okay, so unfortunately we are at time. We are at 7. As for all those links, I have collected them all, and I will make sure to post them whenever I post the recording. Whenever the recording goes up in a day or two, and I'll also post that with any other resources that Erissa gives me, and I'll also make sure to add that link to the list. So yeah, thank everybody for showing up. It's been great. Yeah, have a lovely night.
And just for context, that last link I shared in the chat, it's my accessibility resources page. So it's got like basically everything I shared tonight just about, and then some. So, hey.